Welcome back. This is Lecture 6 of Introduction to Fine Arts. Just to the southwest of Mesopotamia, the region we discussed last time, is a culture that has captured perhaps the most fascination of all, ancient Egypt. Although they traded and interacted with the cultures of Mesopotamia, Egypt managed to preserve its own unique identity throughout the many changes and shifts of their neighbors. It gets up and running a bit later than the Sumerians, but then outlasts everyone by a long shot. Let's take a look at some of the hallmarks of ancient Egyptian culture. If you needed to sum up ancient Egyptian culture in one word, it would be continuity. They were ultra-conservative. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, they were also religious to the excess. They held a mostly unbroken line of cultural identity for over 3,000 years, with very few exceptions. They were unified as a single empire at around 3100 BCE and lasted until they were assimilated by the Romans in 30 BCE. What are the implications of this? What does it mean for a culture to last that long? Compared to the longevity of our own culture, that's an eternity. When I say they were conservative, what I mean is they had an obsession with preservation of the status quo. All aspects of Egyptian life have underpinnings of this timelessness. For art, that meant very strict rules. Once codified, they were never to be broken. Most of their art was funerary. The Ka, sort of like what we think of when we say soul, was the life force that accompanied the deceased body after death. The Egyptians practiced embalming and constructed elaborate tombs for the Ka of their pharaohs. These tombs included objects from life to keep the Ka company after death. They included the preservation of the body as a home for the Ka. Even images served as substitutes just in case something happens to the body. There were even images of servants to accompany the pharaoh in the afterlife. Ironically, they took extra special care of the heart, which they thought held the most significance in a person's identity. As for the brain, they just sucked it out and discarded it because they figured it was useless. The Nile River was their lifeblood. Annual floods made the river valley incredibly fertile. Later, it made Egypt the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. Here's a very early example of Egyptian art, the palette of King Narmer. Palette is a surface on which to mix makeup. Black makeup around the eyes was the equivalent of Egyptian sunglasses. But it's not a real palette. It's commemorative, kind of like Elvis plates on late-night infomercials. You're not actually going to eat off of them. This example is unique in that it's not funerary like most of Egyptian art. It depicts Narmer, a warlord from Upper Egypt, vanquishing his Lower Egypt enemy and establishing an empire of the Nile River. Here's the front of the palette. Two lion's necks are intertwined to make the bowl for mixing in. The imagery from this artifact marks the beginning of Egypt as a distinct culture, with the unification, sort of a euphemism for one side being conquered by another, of Upper and Lower Egypt. In other ways, it is indicative of traditional Egyptian art, though. It establishes the rules of depiction, the Egyptian canon of proportions. This is basically an amalgamation of parts of the body, not concerned with the figure as a whole, and certainly not attempting to make it lifelike or convincing in a representational way. It's based on a grid system. Every unit is a single square in the grid, and this square is the size of the fist. Once the size of each square is established, all the rest of the figure is plotted out along the grid according to exact specifications. This is sometimes known as the Egyptian pose or frontalism. And it's impossible to actually happen in real life. You have the head in profile, and then the eye is taken out of the socket and stuck on the side of the head facing forward. The torso is then frontal, but then magically, without any turn in the hips, the legs are in profile. These different views of the human body are all presented in a single image, kind of like cubism is, that we'll talk about much later on. We also see hierarchical scale, where relative size establishes the importance of the figure. You see here Narmer is presented very large, and all the other figures are smaller, particularly the enemy king who he was about to smite. Why such strict rules? We see this all throughout Egyptian art. Well, one reason is to produce an image that's instantly recognizable. Also, as we talked about already, tradition was really important, and so by having strict rules, it forces you to adhere to tradition. But beyond these things, something you consider: if the imagery is always depicted in the same way, the Ka will always be able to understand it in the afterlife. Hence, this preoccupation with timelessness. Here's a photo taken inside the tomb of Nefertari. Not the more famous Nefertiti, a lot of similar sounding names in ancient Egypt. Almost 2,000 years later than the Palace of King Narmer, but still the same rules apply. Notice the Egyptian pose we just talked about. One particularly striking image that illustrates Egyptian painting is located in the tomb of a scribe named Nebamun. This is Nebamun hunting birds. It's a stylistic depiction, of humans at least compared to animals. And this is seemingly the same rules of depiction that we saw in the cave paintings like eons ago. We see humans here highly stylized, abstracted, this amalgamation of different parts. But if you look closely at the animals, they're much more lifelike, much more naturalistic. It seems so fascinating to me that the same kind of patterns that we saw in the Paleolithic cave paintings seem to apply with these early civilizations. And with these, they are written rules. Why that consistency? Anyway, here we see he's hunting birds and he's crossing the river in the boat. And crossing the river is symbolic of crossing over from life into death. Egyptians enjoyed some of the same pleasures in death as they did in life. They wanted to make sure that they could live them forever. Let's move on to architecture. Egyptian pyramids are the oldest architectural structures we can still see today. Here's the Pyramid of Zoser, designed by Imhotep. Imhotep is the first credited artist in the history of the world. It's the first time we can actually put a name to the artwork. These are similar structurally to the mastabas of Mesopotamia. They had a very different purpose though, which was to protect the tomb. Rather in Mesopotamia, where these mastabas were symbolic mountain temples. The Giza complex is where the most famous pyramids are. The stepped pyramids that we looked at just now kind of evolved into these more refined structures with elaborate hidden chambers and passageways. These pyramids were originally covered with white limestone to create a smooth surface to reflect the sun. The edges of the pyramids were symbolic of sun rays, part of the cult of Re, or the profound significance of the sun in their religious traditions. And these pyramids were part of a massive complex where mysterious and elaborate rituals were carried out. All sorts of mystery and speculation surround Egyptian culture. The Great Sphinx is certainly one example. This massive structure has had a long and storied history since its creation. It's too much to go into here, but worth exploring on your own. Let's look at some sculpture that's not quite so monumental. Here is seated Khafra, who's an Old Kingdom pharaoh. Everything about the style conveys timelessness. The materials, for all these pharaonic sculptures, the materials were almost entirely stone. The depiction, the age of the subject, regardless of the person's actual age, was depicted not young and not old, but kind of right in that middle zone, timeless. These figures aren't performing any actions, they just have this stoic expression of stillness. Moods change, so there's no mood presented here, just a stoic expression. And look at the way the sculpture is stylized. The body and facial features are idealized and non-specific. I don't know that you could see this sculpture and see the Pharaoh Khafra and see the resemblance per se. It's more of a symbol. We see frontal squared hips and a very rigid pose, as if this figure is frozen in time. Here are a couple detail shots. These are carved from the block of a stone, and the block is still visible. The fact that we still see this block kind of reinforces the solidity and the permanence of authority. But when not depicting a pharaoh, the rules aren't quite as strict. Often color is used, and the features are a bit more specific. Still very frontal and solid, but a little bit more lifelike. Here are the prince and princess, Rahotep and Nofret. And this is a side view. Why were pharaohs depicted different than everyone else? How does Egyptian artwork seem to follow similar rules as Paleolithic art? Why do you think these rules exist? To me, the most fascinating part of Egyptian culture is the Amarna period. This is a massive but temporary humanist break with the traditional rules. Tradition was the most important aspect of Egyptian culture, so this break is profoundly significant. I said the word humanism. What is that? In brief, it's a focus on the person as an individual. It acknowledges the fundamental value of humanity, and it's concerned a little more with the here and now as opposed to the gods and eternity. Akhenaten is the individual responsible for this revolution in Egyptian culture. His name had been Amenhotep IV. He took the throne after his father's death. Then he converted to a monotheistic religion that revolved around the sun god Aton and changed his name to Akhenaten. He closed down the temples and he moved the capital. And it sure pissed off the priests and upper classes by undermining their importance. He instituted major changes in art as well. There were elegant curving lines, non-idealized depictions, especially of himself, at least not idealized in the traditional way that would emphasize his masculinity and eternal authority. Depicted here, we see him in this sort of androgynous kind of way. The Amarna period threw out traditional gender norms. In general, much more realism in art happened in the Amarna period as opposed to a strict, idealized, and rigidly formal manner of depiction. Artists were more free in how they worked and what they could create. Here's a relief carving that illustrates the humanist attitudes of the Amarna period. Aton is an abstract representation of God, the disc in the upper part, rather than an animal-human amalgamation of the traditional Egyptian gods. And depicted here is an informal, relaxed scene of Akhenaten, one of his wives, and their children. Royalty is depicted as regular human beings doing relatable things. The sun disk from the top with no gender, the purely abstract form, sort of like Plato talks about later on. Sun rays reach out to touch the figures lovingly. There's an ankh at the end of some of the rays, which is a symbol of life. This is playful. We see a child tugging at the queen's headdress. We see Aton, the god of love rather than war. All nations are equal to Aton. This couldn't be more different than the status quo. This new religion was very unpopular with the upper classes of Egypt because it totally upset the social order and denied the very essence of Egypt's identity. It represented progress and change instead of the ultra-conservative continuity that typified all of Egyptian history up to this point. These foreshadows the same kind of humanism that will come much later with the classical Greek culture. Nefertiti was Akhenaten's principal wife. She wielded a lot of influence. Akhenaten saw her as almost an equal. Their reign was like a partnership. Everything about Akhenaten was hated by the powerful class of Egyptian society. Historians disagree about the demise of Nefertiti and Akhenaten, but it probably wasn't pretty. After Akhenaten, along comes a very minor pharaoh who seems very major to us. Tutankhamun, or King Tut, as is commonly known, was the son of Akhenaten. He took the throne early in life under suspicious circumstances, and he was young enough that it was really his advisors that really did the ruling. We know a lot about him because his tomb was discovered intact, notwithstanding the moral issues of modern Western archaeologists digging through ancient cultures' tombs. But in reality, he wasn't very significant at all. Or rather, he was important in a much different way. With him, Egypt reverted back to its old ways. It would take over 1,000 years for any known civilization to get back to the place Akhenaten took Egypt. I'm always interested in playing the what-if game with history. What if the Amarna period kept going in Egypt? Was it a lost opportunity? Did reverting back to the stodgy, conservative old ways stunt the development of civilization? Imagine if we were 1,000 years further ahead right now. Turning our attention away from Egypt, let's have a brief look at what was happening far away in the Indus River Valley. Starting at around 2600 BCE, cities started forming in this region. Art found from various sites includes sculptures, seals, pottery, gold ornaments, and terracotta figures. The depictions of human and animal figures were highly representational compared to what we've seen. Dancing Girl is a bronze sculpture made through the lost wax casting method in around 2000 BCE. This method of casting is extremely complicated. This meant that cultures outside of Mesopotamia were also highly developed at this time, and discoveries of artworks like these completely upended art historians' beliefs about the timeline of artistic development in early societies. The region surrounding the Yellow River was the cradle of Chinese civilization. People had lived here since the dawn of humanity, but things really kicked into high gear with the Shang dynasty in 1600 BCE. Here we find the earliest written records in China. The dynasty was ruled by hereditary kings who were frequently at war with nomadic tribes of the Asian steppes, who seem to have been a perpetual thorn in their side. This conflict won't go away for a long, long time. Their artworks included decorated animal faces, oracle bones, and containers. Here's a Shang Dynasty bronze vessel. Check out the video I posted about ancient China on the Canvas site, which includes more detail on this fascinating culture. And that's pretty much it for now. Next time, in Introduction to Fine Arts, we'll shift our attention west, to a magical place that has captured the imagination of countless generations and went on to form the foundations of our culture's most enduring myths and legends.